talked about, we said was wholehearted worship, which we define as daily reflecting the glory of God through sacrificial living. And you may think, well, worship, that is for people who go to church and stuff. And we kind of talked that week about that we all worship. We're born worshiping, and that continues until we die, because we all tend to give our adoration, and we're committed to things that are bigger than ourselves, things that we esteem as greater than ourselves. And you see it when people go to a concert, right? You see worship. When you see it when they go to a sporting event, you see worship. They wear the colors, they cheer, they're excited about this thing that they love, and you see worship in those things. And so all of us tend to worship in one way or another. And our big idea that week, the idea worth discussing, was the path to wholehearted worship begins and ends with self-sacrifice, which is one of the most difficult things to do, but one of the most fulfilling things that you can do. And then last week we talked about courageous commitment, and we said that's fully devoting ourselves to next steps of faith. And again, you may think, well, that's for church people, right? I don't have faith. But I believe that everyone is trusting in something that is bigger than themselves, that is outside themselves, something that they don't know, something that they're uncertain about. And we say that everyone has a next step of faith that they can grow in. And our idea worth discussing last week was that countercultural courage moves us towards transformational thinking. And courage is simply a decision that fear doesn't get to make the decisions. And so I'm not going to be afraid of what people think or what people say. I'm going to believe in something that is outside of myself, and I'm going to take next steps. And what that begins to do is transform our minds and the way we think and the way we see the world. And we know that that, again, can help lead to life change. And so this week, we're going to talk about loud love. Loud love. This is the one that people really like, right? Like, loving others is a fun one that everyone's like, yeah, I can get on board with that, right? And so we define it as noticeably doing good for our community, our families, and our church. And again, this is one everyone can just right away get on board with, which is why I was so excited about the discussion today, because I think it's one that is exciting, but it's one that maybe a lot of times churches have gotten wrong, or people who call themselves Christians have gotten wrong. And the culture looks at it and they go, well, they don't seem very loving, they seem very hateful. And so I think it's incredibly important that as a church, that we love loudly, and that we noticeably are doing good for the community around us, that we're noticeably doing good for our families, and we're noticeably doing good for our church, that we're putting that out there. And we get that from the letter to the Galatians. So the church in this area of Galatia, and this guy Paul, who we've talked about before, he was a guy who started churches like this in major cities, and he sent this letter out to these 5 different churches that were in this area. And he tells them this kind of towards the end of his letter. He says, don't be misled. You cannot mock the justice of God. You will always harvest what you plant. Those who live only to satisfy their own sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature. But those who live to please the Spirit will harvest everlasting life from the Spirit. So, based on that truth, let's not get tired of doing what is good. At just the right time, we will reap a harvest of blessing. And literally that word there, in the Greek, it could be translated as happiness if we don't give up. Therefore, whenever we have the opportunity, we should do good to everyone, especially to those of the family of faith. And so that's where we get that. But you may be thinking, Jeremy, the Bible talks a lot about love, and I don't even see the word love in that. I just see like doing good. And so I want to kind of hone in on something that Jesus said when he was asked about love, and we're going to discuss this idea today. Love is less about affection and more about an action. In our culture, we tend to love based on how we feel about someone or something. But Jesus said to love your enemies, and I'm willing to bet that when we think about our enemies, those who oppose us or those who don't like us or those we don't like, affection isn't one of those things that comes into play. So what was he talking about? Well, he was talking about an action. He was talking about the way you live your life, the way you treat them, not necessarily affection. I believe that a lot of times affection will follow this loving action, that I will grow in affection the more I love people. And so our idea today is love is less about affection and more about action. And you may right now disagree with me, and that's cool. We're going to talk about that here in just a second. So we're going to look at what Jesus said. So Jesus was out teaching, doing what he was doing, and he always kind of drew a crowd. And there were a couple different people that were in this crowd. There were like the people that were like his close followers. men and women that really kind of supported his ministry, followed his ministry, everything that he did. And then there were the people that were just checking it out, right? Like they wanted to see a miracle, or they wanted to be fed, or they wanted to just see this guy they've been hearing about. And then there were those people that were there just to try and trip Jesus up, right? They were these religious leaders of the religious law. And what they would do is they spend a lot of time talking about religious law, interpreting this law, and what does it really mean. And there's all kinds of books that you can connect to where you can see what these guys had to say, and I follow this guy, and he teaches this, and so I agree with this interpretation. But they love to follow Jesus around and try and trip him up because he had this Messiah claim. And so one of them was like, okay, Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And this was a pretty easy question. This was something that was in the law already. It was pretty explicit in the Jewish law. And so Jesus was like, well, how do you read it? And the guy said, well, to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, like everything that you have. And he's like, right? And then he said, continue. And he said, okay, well, to love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus was like, nailed it. You got it right, man. I agree. And then the guy did something interesting. And the Bible tells us, it says that he was trying to justify his actions, so he asked this question. So who's my neighbor? Right? Because in Jewish law and Jewish world, their neighbor was this other Jewish person. And so he wanted to justify his actions because clearly he had probably mistreated people who he didn't view as his neighbor. He asked Jesus, so who's my neighbor? And Jesus responds the way Jesus does, is he tells a story. Okay? And we're going to look at that story here in the Gospel of Luke. It says, Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. So we see the victim here is Jewish. Jesus was a Jewish man talking to Jewish people about Jewish law, and he makes the victim here Jewish. Very interesting because of who's going to be the hero. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest, right, a Jewish priest, someone who would work in the temple, a religious leader, came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant, again, somebody who's supposed to be a spiritual leader, this guy works in the temple, walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan, which was redundant in that culture, okay? Because Jewish people hated Samaritans. They considered them inbred. So these were when Jewish people had babies with people who were not Jewish, which was actually against the law. And they looked at these people as the lowest of the low. They would call them dogs, and not like in the cool way we would, but like in a negative way, right? And so a despised Samaritan was like this redundancy of this is a person that people didn't like, that us sitting around here, these Jewish people, that you wouldn't like this guy. That's who comes along. And when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. This word compassion literally means, in the Greek, it's like he hurt in his bowels. On his insides actually began to hurt. Have you ever had that feeling? Like when someone's hurt or someone's injured, or you see the injury of someone and you kind of like your stomach kind of turns and you're like, oh, I imagine that hurts. That happens to me a lot because I'm real queasy. But that was what happened, is this compassion, he felt this love for him, but it happened in his bowels. He could feel it. It says, going over to him. So the other two go away. He goes towards him. The Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn, where he took care of him. The next day, he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins. Some translations say 2 denarii, which was basically a day's wage, telling him, take care of this man. If the bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. Jesus is done with the story, and he says to the man, now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? The man replied, the one who showed him mercy. Then Jesus said, yes, now go and do the same. He didn't say go and feel the same way he felt. He said go and do the same. This action, because love is less about affection and more about an action. And when we love, we see it in action. So I want to look at what Jesus said when he said, go and do the same. I want to look at a few things that this guy did specifically that we can look at as love, and that I believe that we also can go and do the same in our community, with our families, and right here in our church at Downtown Faith. So go and do the same. So what was the first thing he did? Well, be present. Be present, right? The other two guys, they saw it, and they went to the other side of the road. Have you ever been guilty of doing that in someone's life? I know I have. I know I've missed the mark. I've seen the hurt. I've seen the pain. And maybe I feel uncomfortable. Maybe I don't know what to do, and I go to the other side of the road. But this Samaritan went straight to the guy. He went over to him. His compassion drew him over to this guy, and he was present with him. Sometimes just presence is one of the most loving things you can do, is to be with somebody. Hospital visits as a pastor, very difficult for me. Very difficult for me. And I was telling someone this recently as I was rushing to the hospital. Someone who's been coming to church here at Downtown Faith had to be rushed to the hospital, and it seemed very serious. Ended up not being, thankfully. And as I was going, I was texting somebody, hey, I'm sorry, I had to reschedule our meeting. I'm going to make a hospital visit. These are always very difficult for me. And he said, just be there. That's all they want. I was like, oh, okay, I can do that, right? And big as I am, I can be this big presence. In his book, Love Does, Bob Goff, a really interesting book, by the way. I would highly encourage you to read it. This guy is one of the most fantastic, fascinating people I've ever heard speak. He says, I used to want to fix people. Now I just want to be with them. You don't need a plan. You just need to be present. That sometimes that first act of presence can be the most meaningful, loving thing that we can do. Think about how you can be present for people this week. Think about someone in your life that just needs you to sit with them, not solve their problems, just sit with them. Again, I think that's something we all struggle with, being present. But next we see that go and do the same, and be present and be helpful. The guy didn't just go over and sit with the guy until he died, right? Like he helped him. He gave of himself in ways to help him. He bandaged him up. He put him on his own donkey. He took him to a place to be cared for. Has anyone ever tried to love you and they really gave a good attempt, but they weren't very helpful? Right? Like the things they said didn't really matter, didn't really apply to your situation, or the whole time you're just thinking, can you just shut up? Like, you're not being helpful right now. I think we've all felt that. And maybe we've even been the person that we're really trying to help, but we're not being all that helpful. I think it's so insightful to be able to look at a need and know how to be helpful, to ask the right questions of what will help this situation, and to be present with someone and to be helpful. This happened a lot when I would working with teenagers as a teacher and as a youth worker in a church, and a lot of times I would give these token answers to their problems. It would be very unhelpful. And I realized, I remember talking to a young man named Chase when I was young, early 20s myself, and he was a freshman in high school and going through some serious things. And every answer I gave, he's like, that doesn't apply, and he would tell me how it didn't apply to his situation. And then finally I just was like, okay, well then how about I just give you a big hug, and we just sit here. And it was one of the most helpful things, but it took me a while to get to that. And as I grow older, as I mature, as I'm helping people, I really, really, really want to be able to ask the right questions, to look into the life of a person and say, how can I be present and how can I be helpful? And that's what it means to love loudly. But then he did one more thing, and he was generous. He was present, he was helpful, and he was generous. He gave a day's wage to see the guy taken care of, and then said, hey, if any more comes up, I will pay it. I'll take care of it. And generosity is a tough one. A lot of us are willing to help as long as it doesn't cost us something. A lot of us are willing to be present as long as it only costs us time. This guy went full on into the situation. And Jesus said he wasn't just present, he wasn't just helpful, he was generous. And we're actually going to talk about that next week more. So I'm not going to expound on it too much because we're going to talk about our last core value, give generously. You're like, oh, that's when the pastor starts talking about money. I'm not going to be here that week. I promise you, It's not what you think, and we're going to be very, very helpful next week when it comes to what it means to give generously. So I would encourage you to come back and hear more about that. But we see it in this guy. He was present, he was helpful, he was generous. It was not about how he felt. It started that way, right? Like compassion was present. But the real love, the real mercy that he showed, the way to be the neighbor that loves the neighbor, even though he was his opposite, even though this man probably would have woke up and thought, a Samaritan helped me, I hate those people, right? He still went into the situation, into the mess. He was present, helpful, and generous. And Bob Goff, in his book, Love Does, he says, simply put, love does. It's an action. Love does. And when we love loudly at Downtown Faith, we want to do something actively. We had our laundry project, our first one in 2017, a couple weeks ago. Why? Because we get to go do something for somebody in a noticeable way and say, hey, listen, the only reason we're doing this is because we love you. We're not trying to guilt you into coming to our church. We don't want a donation. We don't want anything from you. We just know that this might be a tough time for you. You might be here because something happened in your home and in your life that's stressing you out right now. We want to be present, we want to be helpful, and we want to be generous. And so I would encourage you in your life as an individual to love loudly, but also to partner with what Downtown Faith does as we as an organization love loudly here in downtown Las Vegas. We're going to discuss this idea. Love is less about affection and more about an action. But throughout this whole series, we've been hearing from some other core team members. And today, we're going to hear from a core team member, Stephanie, who's going to just talk about what it means to her to love loudly.
My name is Stephanie. I'm on the core team at Downtown Faith. I've been part of the core team for a little bit over a year. Met Jeremy at one of the downtown events, the podcast, which ended up being called Downtown Talk Show, and that was great. And I hold roles in the Laminin circle of our organization, of our church, which is focused on knowing and caring for people. The Bible gives us copious amounts of ways to love each other, to love ourselves, to love God, and points toward and explicitly says, this is the point of all of it. You know, every other good thing is from this thing. And not only is it from this thing, but this thing is another name for God. Like, this is it. This is the thing, you know? So to love loudly, to me, is to just take that part of our lives and of who we are and turn it up. Downtown, there's a lot of different cross-sections of different people and life experience, and every single day, I think you can be presented with the opportunity to, you know, give a smile or a quick $5 or, you know, something, or you can look someone in the eye and you can ask how their day was, not in the like, how's your day? Fine. How's yours? Good. But in a like, how, you know, you're another human being and I'm taking this moment to create space and acknowledge that and allow for a connection there. And that there's a lot of different people and a lot of different spaces, and that can happen down here. I think that encouraging someone to embrace this value, it's going to look different for every person. It's going to be a lot of, it's going to require some introspection and asking, what are my go-to methods for love? And, you know, let's amplify that too. You know, definitely play to your strengths. And what are the things that make me uncomfortable that are still going to make a big difference to someone else, you know, because we tend to find discomfort in other people's pain, right? It's hard to sit with something you can't fix. It's hard to just be there, right? And yet we've all been in a situation where we're experiencing pain, or we're down on our luck, or we, you know, are experiencing some personal stuff and we don't want to talk about it because we feel terrible and, you know, unlovable or unlikable or what have you. And the most excruciating blessing is to have someone just sit with you and really hear it and just be okay with that.
Slow down and look, and what you